going to go ahead and get started. So if anybody's still out in the hall, please come on in and have a seat. I'm actually really excited to be here today with you all. I'm certain that you have things to do with your Mondays, but I'm very grateful that you decided to join us here for this very important conversation. This is, I think, our 77th town hall, 76th town hall. Since I've joined office about 5 or so years ago. We try to do a town hall about once every month or more, and we also try to make sure that we rotate them around the community. And so it's really awesome to be here in the Reading community today. Go ahead, next slide, please. Welcome again. My name is Chrissy. I know some of you, and some of you are new to me, and I hope that I had the chance to greet you in person, and if not, I welcome the opportunity to do that afterwards, or perhaps in our office, which is literally just across the street, in the facility across the street. Today we are going to be having a town hall, as I mentioned. This town hall will be focused on literacy, early childhood literacy, and childhood development. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to do that with some of the people who know childhood issues the best, Sesame Street, and Dr. Jeanette Betancourt, who will be joining us shortly for that conversation. I will also be introducing, or actually Dr. Mooney will be introducing the rest of our panelists as well, and we will have a moderated question and answer period after that as well. You all should probably also have gotten a piece of paper for questions. Next slide, please. So our town halls, speaking about literacy and education, are a little bit different than many town halls. Our town halls are designed to be informative and educational, and they're designed to be usually about a very specific subject, so that we can have an opportunity to take a deep dive into something that's relevant and important to our community. And this is no exception, of course, with childhood development and childhood literacy. Another thing that I think is really important about our town halls is that taking a page out of education and classroom management and behavior issues, we want to make sure that we're treating each other with respect and with dignity while we're here in this space, that we want to make sure that everybody feels like that they're welcome here, that they can have their questions asked and answered, and that they feel as though what is true. We are all here because we care deeply about this nation. We all are here because we care deeply about our families and our community, and we want to make sure we're creating an environment where that is the case. And so these are not too dissimilar from when you're in a classroom, and many of you guys are educators. These are the norms that we will present ourselves with during this presentation and discussion. Next slide. So you all should have come in and maybe gotten a card. If you didn't get a card, if you wouldn't mind putting your hands up, and we've got members from Team Houlihan here who can give you a card. Please be sure, even if you don't have a question, to write your name and information down so that we can make sure to put you on our mailing list for things like our newsletters, for things like opportunities to know what's going on and when these kinds of events are happening. But if you do happen to have a question for the town hall, please turn the card over and write your question down on the back. At this point, handwriting does count because we'd like to make sure that we can read it as well. Sometimes we have a hard time reading it. Our town halls also are sorted by topic subject. So if there are 7 or 8 questions on one particular subject, our moderator, Dr. Mooney, will be putting all of those together into one area. And we do that so that we can make sure that we are good with our time management and that we don't waste people's time asking the same question 7 or 8 times. So please make sure that you write your question if you have one on the back. Next slide, please. I come to this conversation about education and specifically early childhood literacy honestly. I come here because before running for Congress and before joining and serving us in Congress, I actually was deeply involved in this very subject. I really genuinely believe that aside from many of the things that are going on in our national discourse about our government, that one of the biggest issues and the biggest threats to the success of our nation's economy and future is whether or not we're able to take care of the education of our next generation. Education is absolutely one of the pressing and most urgent needs of our nation. And so before running for Congress, I was doing a bunch of things in this space. First off, I quit my job when I was about 45 years old, went back to school, relearned chemistry and relearned biology, joined the classroom at Simon Gratz teaching high school chemistry. Experienced there a really important lesson that I think many of you already know as parents and as educators, which is if you don't have basic literacy skills, You are going to struggle trying to engage and embrace things like chemistry, and you're going to really struggle to be able to participate in our economy in an active and productive way. My kids at Gratz, many of my children at Gratz, 11th graders, were reading at the 3rd and 4th grade level. And so that's why I pivoted at that point in time to help grow and run a new company that was started at this point nearly 10 years ago called Springboard Collaborative. And my job at Springboard Collaborative was to help scale a concept that helped kids pre-K through 4th graders who were at schools such as Simon Gratz be able to gain literacy skills at the same rate that their peers are that were in communities that were more well-resourced. And so that concept was grown from the startup to a national organization now serving tens of thousands of children over the course of the last 10 years or so. So that's my background, and that's what I bring to the conversation. And of course in Congress we'll have some longer conversations about what I'm doing specific to education. You all also should have gotten a one-pager that has some information about what's going on in Congress in this space in case you'd like to take a look at that. Now I have the distinct privilege to introduce Dr. Jeanette Betancourt to be able to present to us some of the awesome information that she's bringing down probably from the New York area. Dr. Betancourt is the Senior Vice President of the U.S. Social Impact at the Sesame Street Workshop. I never thought I'd be able to introduce somebody from Sesame Street. They are my heroes. Sesame Street Workshop, as you all probably know, is the nonprofit that's behind Sesame Street and that works to make sure that kids everywhere can grow smarter, stronger, and kinder. At the Sesame Street Workshop, Jeanette directs the development and implementation of community and family engagement initiatives to positively impact our most vulnerable children and their families. And I hope that we have a really great conversation. And without further ado, I introduce Dr. Betancourt to the stage for her presentation.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be here and to be here with all of you. It's a pleasure to be here for several reasons, because I look to each and every one of you for a particular reason. You are the ones that make, just the fact you are here, you are the ones who make a difference in young children. Your interest in speaking about and knowing about early literacy is much more expansive. I want you to think of each and every one of you as key influencers in young children's development. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Sesame Workshop, but before I start, I want you to just quickly turn to a neighbor and just turn to them and tell them your favorite Muppet. Just turn. You can make friends easily. Usually I allow a little more time, but we want to make sure we have the panel. But it's hard to pull you away, right? As we say in early childhood, eyes on you. Thank you all. You saw the vibrancy and the connection and the memories, and I can see all the smiles that each of you have. So let me begin with a slide here. Can I have the first slide, please? All right, I'll begin. You'll get the slides up. I know the mic memory. So once you get the slides up, it's coming. All right, let me begin with the title of what we're talking about is The Joy of Learning Together. And knowing, there we are. Next slide, please. All right, so believe it or not, we started Sesame Workshop or Sesame Street in 1969. I say this now because we're cutting across 3 generations now. Parents, little ones, and now grandparents. That memory of connection. It is always the idea from Sesame Workshop is how could we use media, education, and research and bring those influences around young children in whatever way possible. We are a global organization. Next slide, please. We're a global organization whose mission is to help all children grow smarter, stronger, and kinder. And when you hear that, what you hear is that in early childhood, there are different areas of development. There's cognitive development, there's social emotional development, there's physical development. And our effort is to use the power of education, of media, and also of resources to bring that influence and that feeling of connection that you just felt with our Muppets and those memories. One of the areas that we try to do is think of empowering every generation to make a better world. And for us, it is like the connection with Sesame Street. We believe that young children can only be nurtured with the adults around them, whether it's parents, caregivers, or influencers such as yourselves, who may be in fields really truly influencing young children. One area, next slide, that you may not know about, you may know our programming, but you may not know our social impact. Our social impact work is all the things that we create beyond our programming. All of the things that we create are resources for providers, parents, and caregivers to influence young children's development. And one of the things I'm going to ask you in the last slide is to take out your phones, because I have the QR code for all of these resources. We cover every facet of young children's development, from very tough topics such as coping with grief, divorce, parental addiction, parental incarceration, community violence. We also deal with all the other areas that nurture young children's development, whether it's literacy, math, whether it is the idea of the joy of play and the value of play, as well as keeping healthy bodies and healthy minds. Lastly, we also provide a tremendous amount of professional development that every provider can use. We create these resources research-based. We hear from parents, caregivers, and community organizations, but most of all, we also create them bilingually, in Spanish and English, with the Spanish it's its own unique version. Now, for the next slide, you'll see that we have the QR code, or you can text. Those resources are there for you to share and to know about. We're now going to get into the next part of our panel discussion, and it's just a pleasure to be able to share a little bit about Sesame Workshop, and I look very much forward to the discussion and questions alike. Thank you so much.
I think this is on. Thank you, Doctor. That was awesome. My favorite Muppet is Elmo, and also Bunsen, Honeydew, and Beaker. I know that they're not Sesame Street, but they're also on my favorites list. It is my privilege to introduce Dr. Looney, the president of our hosting model, our hosting university or community college, to the stage.
Thank you, Representative Houlihan. And it is a pleasure to be here moderating this wonderful panel today. So as you can see from the slide, we've already, of course, met Representative Houlihan and Dr. Betancourt. I'd like to now introduce Shantae Brown from the Pennsylvania Deputy Secretary, Office of Child Development and Early Learning, as well as Dr. Michelle Reichert-Huff, the Director of Early Childhood and Student Services at the BCIU. So I have questions for each of you prepared, and then we will use questions from the audience. And the first question is for Representative Houlihan. Earlier in your career, you worked for Teach for America as a chemistry teacher, and then led a nonprofit literacy group. How has your work as an educator influenced your work in Congress?
Thank you for the question. It's really, as I tried to articulate probably poorly, central to why I serve in Congress right now is my belief that it is really important that all citizens have the opportunity to serve and to participate in our community and in our nation fully. So not dissimilar from the Sesame Street mission. And so prior to joining Congress, I was trying to do my best in service in that education space. And here now in Congress, I have the opportunity to try to do my best to serve in other places. But that doesn't mean that my education, experience, and background isn't with me all the time. My dad was a Holocaust survivor and came here as a very small child, and when we were little, my father would always say, the only thing that they can't take away from you is your education. It's the thing that you carry with you, regardless of if you carry anything else. I think it's the thing that I remember all the time. And so everywhere that I'm able to in Congress, I try to make sure that I think about that. Right now I'm on the Armed Services Committee, and so some of the work that I can do within the Armed Services Committee and specifically within Military Personnel Subcommittee, which I also serve on, has to do with the people who wear the uniform on behalf of our nation and all of the families that support them and their children. So much of the work, and you'll see it on the one pager that I work on in the education spaces with that. But I also have the opportunity to think about these issues all the time with things like on the Armed Services Committee, as an example, we put legislation language into the NDAA, which is the Defense Authorization Act, that tries to understand why it is that 70% of the people who try to be in our all-voluntary military are not eligible or qualified. And a lot of the time, the reason that 70% of people aren't eligible to participate is because of issues of learning and their ability to read or to have numeracy skills. And so by putting that legislation, that report language in to say, tell us why by zip code people are not able to participate in our all-volunteer military, it helps us understand by zip code where we are failing as an education system. And so that will then be able to feed into the larger education and labor committees, as well as all the resources and funding that we give to our schools around this country. So I try every day to do that, but I also, importantly, I hope you notice, try to take the lessons of the classroom here too, to make sure that we are treating each other with respect and dignity, and that we recognize each one of us is here with a purpose.
Thank you for that thoughtful answer, appreciate that. The next question is for Dr. Betancourt. It's actually a two-part question, so I'll do the first one. What are the most important things we can do to support literacy development, starting with the youngest children?
Thank you. One of the things, is the mic on?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that you find is, particularly for young parents nowadays, they're very busy and there's an environment of media all around us. One of the things is to appreciate the conversations in everyday moments that we encounter. Language and conversation is the foundation of early literacy, building a certain degree of vocabulary. How can you do that? It's taking advantage of everyday moments. Those everyday moments become essential in sort of children understanding from the very beginning their environment. One of the things I ask you to do is make believe you're holding a little one, a little child. Everybody, make believe you're holding a little child right there, all right? You notice the width from here to here, all right? Automatically, as adults, we're programmed to connect with our little one. That distance is really, throughout, globally, it's the same distance. It is our first connections. Setting the foundation of connection, conversation, and everyday moments sets the path. One last thing is the idea of we are in a community that actually has an incredible benefit. There are many people here who are English language learners. The appreciation of having a second language and developing that. Saber inglés como español is an asset for our children, not a deficit. It is not confusing to have children learn more than one language at the same time. And understanding that from the very beginning is actually a critical foundation in early literacy. We have many resources to help in that, and it really is very important that nurturing connections.
I'll use that advice, thank you. So as a follow-up, can you please tell us more about Sesame Workshops initiatives on mental health and emotional well-being? Why is this topic so top of mind right now?
Yeah. We've all just came across several years now of a pandemic, and we often think that the cause of the mental health crisis in our nation is because of the pandemic, and that's not really true. It was exacerbated. Our youth are experiencing greater suicidal ideations, greater depression, greater areas of challenges to their mental health. Our focus lately, though, which is increasing and very helpful, is on youth, it is on adults, but we're neglecting our young children, and we forget the impact, not only that the pandemic, but prior to the pandemic, especially for those most marginalized, has had on children's mental health. If you know, I'm not saying social emotional development, but mental health. Mental health means a child or an individual's being of self, being able to have emotional connections, understanding one's feelings, but also having the idea of feeling safety, comfort, joy, and hope for the future. We have neglected young children's mental health. And so as an organization, we look where are there gaps and we hope to fill them. We're creating resources to help children develop their emotional well-being, but also identify what we're calling emotional distress tipping points. Catching it early before we have to do prevention instead of intervention. So think of mental health, all the services being provided, also start in early childhood.
Such interesting work from the Sesame Workshops Initiative. I could have listened all day just to that topic, so thank you for sharing. The next question is for Shantae Brown. Your work as a teacher, a community advocate, and in teacher leadership uniquely positions you in your work for our Commonwealth. What advice would you give to our student teachers and potential education majors in the audience?
I had to think about this a little bit, and then I started jotting some additional notes because you want to be able to tell future educators everything. But the biggest piece for me, and has always been in all the positions that I've been in, particularly in this one, is to really be thoughtful around collaborative relationships. You have to make and understand the value of them, because as a teacher, it helps you to gain access to resources, not just for you, but also for your students. As a community advocate, you get to inform others about our very unique and challenging sector. Education is hard, and you do want to be able to communicate that to others and and it allows you to share the overall needs of your sector. And then finally, as a leader, it just makes you approachable and gives you a lens or another sense of perspective. So I would definitely talk about the value of relationships and continuing those collaborative relationships. For potential educators, I would just say, come on in, the water is fine. Sometimes I feel like teaching, it gets a bad rap, but it is extremely rewarding. I miss my teaching days. My husband will tell you I still sing a lot of the songs that I had in the classroom in our home. It is never boring, and although it may be challenging, you will get to have days that are fun, and no one day or any days will be the same. Do we have any future ECE teachers in the room? Nothing like it. Not that I always tell my K to 12 or my 3 to 6th grade teachers that we work with sometimes. I'm not being biased in any way, but I absolutely see the value of teaching and play and teaching through learning. Play through learning. It's really, really important, and I feel like as an ECE educator, I got to play every day, but we were teaching so many valuable skills. We had so many conversations that was helping to enhance their vocabulary. So please, please, please understand the value of the work that you do. Please do not let anyone devalue you in any way. It is absolutely very rewarding. And I would just always encourage folks to be thoughtful about those relationships that you are making, because they're beneficial not just to you, but also to the folks that you serve, the families and the children.
Thank you for sharing that advice, and I know we definitely have some future educators out there, at least from the Reading Area Community College Early Childhood Education team. So thank you so much for sharing that. Next question is for Dr. Reichert Huff. Head Start was created in 1964, almost 60 years ago. How does Head Start prepare our children for elementary school?
Thank you for the question, Dr. Looney, and thank you, Representative Houlihan, for including BCIU on the panel today. We are fortunate to run a Head Start program here in Berks County, and one of the things that really stands out to me as a Head Start program is how the program provides comprehensive early childhood supports and services to students and children who are at risk for school failure or school struggles due to their socioeconomic status. Really, the mission of the Head Start program is to ensure that every child, regardless of their socioeconomic status, has quality early childhood experiences and those wraparound supports that are really just essential to their overall child development. So when we look at our Head Start program here in Berks County, we really look at 4 different areas. One that is probably the most familiar is the early childhood classrooms, where our teachers provide opportunities for students to explore, to question, to communicate. And they utilize evidence-based curriculum to ensure that we're providing them developmentally appropriate services and activities that foster those 5 areas we were talking about, the social, the emotional, cognitive, and physical growth, which really is important for that successful transition into elementary school. But above and beyond that, Head Start, which sometimes goes unnoticed, has a key priority on the health and well-being of our young children. The program looks at things such as those regular health screenings, access to nutritious meals, and access to medical and dental care homes so that our students are being cared for as a whole child and those health needs are being prioritized, knowing that our healthiest learners are going to go to school ready to learn and really absorb those opportunities that are available to them. So we do have a huge focus on health and nutrition across our Head Start programs. In addition, not only do we focus on the children, we focus on the families and what the families' needs are for supporting their children and raising youth. So our family engagement workers really focus in on those parental engagement pieces, whether that's workshops, training sessions, or home visits. It's really about empowering parents to be the first educator, the child's first teacher. And those Sesame Street workshops are just perfect tools to be getting out to families because there's something easy to access at home. And then finally, Head Start, when you look in our classrooms, you see a culture of belonging, you see inclusivity. There's specialized supports available, whether it's through mental health and partnering with our community agencies for students who may have some challenges with mental health or behavior, but also partnering with our early intervention programs to ensure that we're including children with disabilities. And those experiences by including children with diverse needs, and that includes also children who speak diverse languages or have different cultural backgrounds, really promotes empathy. It promotes that feeling of belonging, and it fosters those early friendships and sets the foundation for students going into elementary school. So we are just so fortunate to have the opportunity to hold a Head Start grant here in our local community and really empower our students and families to take options and opportunities that wouldn't be available without the subsidized funding for students that are living at a poverty level within their family. And it really just enhances all that we see as students go into kindergarten. It levels the playing field so that they're entering with the readiness to learn and the foundation to take full experiences in kindergarten and beyond.
Thank you very much. That was extremely comprehensive. I appreciate that.
Did I say it?
You did great.
I get a little excited.
Yeah, I can see your passion. It's terrific. So we're going to begin questions from the audience, and I actually have one that piggybacks off of Dr. Riker-Tuff's response, but this might be a question for anyone on the panel. And it talks about Head Start being fantastic, and however, there's really, the hours are limited. And how can we fund these additional wraparound services for all students? So specifically, they mentioned it's great that we have federal and state funding for pre-K counts and Head Start. However, the hours operations of these programs create the need for before and after care for students, student parents. Are there any plans to support working and student parents who need wraparound childcare before and after this program? And that's a big question.
So I think it would just depend on the needs of the program. So Pennsylvania is a place and space where folks are encouraged to blend and braid funding. There are some benefits and there are both challenges to that, but if there are working students and or families, I do believe our subsidy regulations are actually in the process of going before the regulatory board to be changed so that working students could move forward and start applying for subsidized childcare to cover before and after care services that both Head Start or our pre-K counts programs do not cover. And it would be the same for families. So I know the income eligibility recently for families had been decreased, and it's caught up right now in the budget, but we intend to still allow families at the 235 of the federal income guidelines to be able to come into our system. So those are changes that are tied up right now into not necessarily the regulatory piece, I apologize. The subsidy piece will go before the regulatory board in September. But the income eligibility for our subsidized programs are tied up into what is happening with our budget, but hopefully once that is resolved, we'll be able to allow that income eligibility expansion to continue.
And if I could just offer a little bit at the federal, more reflections than anything else. We have an issue in this nation with a lot of things, childcare and education, and family leave is an example being just some of them that really affect us every day. I think we made some good efforts and great strides towards addressing these wraparound and hours issues last Congress, the 117th Congress, but unfortunately we weren't able to get them across the finish line. So now in the 118th Congress, as you recall, your Schoolhouse Rock, everything starts over again every 2 years. So we back up and we start again, and we're backing up and we're starting again on both childcare, which has something to do with the hours and the availability of places like Head Start, and also things like family leave. And I really do think that we, even though you hear a lot about the dissonance in Washington, I do think we have some opportunities in these spaces of family leave and childcare in the very narrow majorities and minorities that we have in terms of the R's and the D's. We all have an agreement that we should have done more and can do more in these spaces. And so I have hope, including the fact that President Biden had a panel, brought a bunch of folks down to Washington to focus on childcare issues just I think a week or two ago, and some folks from our area were invited to join in that. As well, the Chamber of Commerce, the Chambers of Commerce across this country, which are historically known for not necessarily being as strong of advocates for these issues, are very much behind the importance of making sure that we accelerate our interest in family leave and childcare. So the wheels are moving, albeit slowly, at the federal level, and I really would encourage you guys to advocate and call your representatives of all forms to let them know that this is important, because you're also probably watching the national news that budgets and budgetary issues, just like in Pennsylvania, are a big issue, and spending not just the same, but actually less. If we're going to try to figure out where our money matters where our kids are and where our families are. So please let people know who you elect that that's important to you.
When I heard the representative speaking, I did want to add that the Office of Child Care right now is thinking about redoing what they call their final rule. So their set of regulations to be more thoughtful around child care requirements. That draft is currently available, and you can read it and provide comment on it. So this is definitely the time to do so. So even on the federal level, they have been thinking about eligibility requirements, enrollment requirements, and what families and providers need. So we would just encourage folks to also make comment to that final rule, if you're so inclined. They did summarize it, so you don't have to read the whole thing. You can just read parts of it that may apply to you.
Thank you for sharing that. So we're going to switch topics just a tad. This is a question I'm hearing quite a bit, even at the college level. But with all of the artificial intelligence, text composition, and text-to-voice applications, How do we convince children that reading and writing is still relevant? And that's for anyone on the panel. I'll open that up.
Maybe I'll start that. Like everything, AI is a new path for all of us. And there's many things happening now with AI as we're going forward. One is that eventually there's a lot of innovation. This is the time of innovation, but it's also the time of lack of control. So there's two paths happening. One is the innovation path of AI for everything. It's going into every sphere, but at the same time, it's also the path of how do we monitor, how do we control, what do we do? So keeping those paths in mind, how does that influence young children? Young children already are learning differently. They've been exposed to a variety of media in different ways. I'm sure if you see young children nowadays, you may see them in front of screens earlier and earlier. We always say that it's the quality of the experience on the screen and also the quantity of experience on the screen. That does not mean that media is entirely adverse. It is how do we monitor, how do we use it. As we progress with AI, there's a lot of progress now or innovation going on actually in ways that are fostering creative ways, like I said at the very beginning, of interactions in different ways. Especially in marginalized communities, often those interactions become a little bit more limited. AI can model that. It again depends how we use it and with whom and how we guide it. However, it will be with us. It's not going to go away. And it's how we use it to the benefit of young children. And keeping in mind, AI is another way to be automatically a translator for many tools. Language, information, and efforts.
So I'm so excited about AI and so scared about it all at the same time. And I think that that's not dissimilar from any other disruptor that's happened to our economy and to our world over eons. I would say that to encourage children, all children, and I consider myself one because I'm not grown up yet, to explore all of the opportunities, you basically need to have the basic building blocks to be able to understand and explore them. And so those basic building blocks are literacy and numeracy and financial literacy and all of the SEs that you need to make sure that you have so that you can be agile in this economy because it's moving fast, and so that you can continue to reskill and retool yourself. And so to me, it's an argument for being engaged in the basics of education so that you can be involved in understanding the powers of things like AI. In my office right now, we have a new team that we just stood up, which is the ChatGPT team, the AI team. We're just out there learning what can we do to use the powers of AI, and they're challenging each other on this little squad to figure it out and figure out different applications that would be useful for our office and for our constituent services in particular. The last thing that I'll end with also is that all of this stuff doesn't mean anything if all of us don't have equity and equal access to all of these things. And so things like broadband, we have $8 billion coming to the state of Pennsylvania to help make sure that everybody has broadband access and equal broadband access, and that allows us all to be able to even begin to use and utilize things like AI.
Extremely interesting topic, and I completely agree with both comments. It's not going away, so it's now an opportunity to just maximize it and learn a bit. So this next question is actually for anyone on the panel as well. As asked earlier about the number of future educators sitting in here today, is there any thoughts on when child care education wages might be improved?
I mean, I can certainly take it. I do know that this is an ongoing issue. I think it is attributed to the way that we fund our system. Our system is braided and blended funding, and that makes it challenging. One of the things that the Commonwealth has been committed to is increasing the overall cost of care. And I'll just start with the market rate. So when we talk about our market rate, our subsidy rate, it's the rate that our subsidy payments are, or the percentage of subsidy payments versus our private pay payments. We acknowledge that that was extremely low, and so over the course of the past 3 years, we were able to go from about the 30th or 40th percentile up to the 60th percentile. The current administration, the Shapiro administration, is wants to continue to support those efforts. So $67 million have been invested or is tied up in the current budget. So it's proposed to be able to continue those investments for our subsidy childcare. Additional wages, we certainly have to talk more about the cost of care and elevate that as an issue. I think when folks have a better understanding of what the cost of care looks like, and not just in terms of different programs. So we're not going to talk about what a Head Start teacher makes versus what a pre-K counts teacher makes versus what a child care teacher makes. It's when children are in care and alternative care in these classrooms, what should these teachers be making when they're there? And we have to start those conversations, and we've been elevating those conversations, and the new administration has been very, very invested in hearing more about them. So I do think that there will be some changes over time. Change takes time, and that's the challenge. But we are trying to elevate the needs of childcare workers so that folks understand that they should be compensated the way that all of our other teachers are compensated. It shouldn't be a separate model that childcare teachers or professionals make less. So really looking forward to continuing those conversations. I'll probably start engaging folks in these ongoing conversations and bringing in both secretaries. So both Secretary Momin from Education and Secretary Arkush from DHS, so that we can start to elevate these conversations and talk about better investments for childcare.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on wages for?
It's hard not to comment on these issues. This is a really big deal, right? We should pay people because what they're doing is they're taking care of our children, and they're also educating the next generation, and that's probably some of the most important jobs that there are out there, and we don't value them in the ways that we ought to. We also need to recognize that we have ways to affect change, and that's obviously through state and through federal initiatives. And we've come close. As I mentioned earlier, the care economy was almost all the way through the legislative process the last time around, and I still have hope that we can make it happen this time around. I guess what I would also ask you guys to do is to think about the consequences of not having educators and caregivers. I had the opportunity to visit a care center in Kennett relatively recently that had the ability to have several educators and caregivers, but weren't able to find enough people because frankly they could earn more money doing something else, like working at Target as an example. And as a consequence, an entire classroom was empty because there was no caregiver and educator there. And as a consequence to that, let's call it 12 children were not in classes. And let's call it the consequence to that is their parents were not in jobs. Because they couldn't bring their child to child care because there was no child care available and no educational enrichment available to them. So this affects our economy. In this specific case, you guys saw a little thing up there that I brag on our mushroom industry. Our mushroom farms are really struggling right now because we have labor issues, and that of course affects the cost of mushrooms, the cost of you guys going to the grocery store. So this is all cyclical, and if we don't value educators, if we don't value child care providers, then we're not valuing the children and the families, and we are also playing into the consequences in our economy.
Very well said, thank you. Financial literacy is viewed as one way to help educate our next generation. What can our legislators do to make sure financial literacy is taught in our schools? And this can be to Chrissy, to Jente, anyone on the panel. Thoughts on financial literacy?
I think financial literacy is critical. We work a lot with some of the schools around our area to make sure that they have modules, and some of them are outboard of the regular day. I think honestly, if I were to evaluate my parenting skill, the one thing I failed at was financial literacy for my children, and they're very accomplished young people, but I think that it is essential that you make sure that in addition to having basic numeracy skills and literacy skills, that you also know how to sort of manage your small little economy that is you and your family. We do have some of those curricula going on in different places. It's not something that's federally mandated, although there are some initiatives for that to happen in places like Defense Department schools. But everywhere that I have the opportunity to talk about this and elevate this, we do. A lot of, frankly, of our industry and businesses in our community are working on this. A lot of the credit unions, credit card unions in our communities actually are in the schools, making sure that people understand what kind of banking opportunities there are and how to be responsible with their resources. And that's a great example of public-private partnership that benefits us all.
Sesame Workshop, if you notice the term financial literacy, there's a variety of literacy and foundational skills that we want our young children to have. So we've developed actually financial literacy resources, again, freely available in that QR code that you all have, that is specifically for families and for young children. So we broke it down in the ideas of Elmo learning how to spend, save, and share. And also the idea that is relevant to both adults and little ones, how to manage needs and wants. How do you look at those components? The idea also of a lot of our civic education connecting with financial literacy, that idea of giving back. So all of those elements are really foundational skills in financial literacy, but at the same time, they're almost foundational skills for family life. And that's the way we've approached it.
It's outstanding. Again, I find that whole area just very unique. Anyone else want to comment on financial literacy?
I was just going to talk about some of the resources that are available, but they're spread out in different regions. So I would just encourage folks, if they're interested in having more financial literacy, because it's not a requirement right now, that you have to just elevate your voice and kind of advocate. I know in Philadelphia, Women's Way was doing a lot of financial literacy work with some Head Start partners around getting families set up to be thoughtful around savings and having end goals and doing some retirement savings as you think about your long-term goals. So I just would encourage folks to kind of elevate that as a necessity or a requirement, because I totally support it too, but if it's not required, then folks are getting it very sporadically in resources in their local regions.
Thank you very much. Michelle?
When I go back to the Head Start parent engagement and family support section, I think, very often there's those of us who are, in our own careers and didn't have that core instruction, and making sure that those gaps are filled as parents are seeing their children go through courses like financial literacy, because very often children will learn kind of the patterns that they see, and ensuring there's a parent component to some of those resources and things that are shared out too, which can start as early as in those Head Start classrooms.
Thank you all for sharing. I appreciate that. The next I'm going to just make it a little more generic, but how do we get more females into STEM? With a panel of all females.
It's such a challenge. I graduated college 30-something years ago, and I was one of 10 women in my engineering curriculum. There were 100, so 90 and 10. My daughter graduated from the same school 5 or 6 years ago, and the same engineering field still had only 10% women, 30 years later. So we are struggling to make progress, and it is slow, but it is something that we can all focus on and we can all concentrate on. Here's how I think we can do it. One is we can make sure that we tell all of our kids, including the little girls, I have 3 who are now big girls, that they can do it and that this is important. That science and math are fun, and project-based learning, exploratory learning, STEM and STEAM, making sure that the arts are included in it is something that they can embrace and are capable of. And I think that's really an important message to send, particularly as they start getting older and they start, frankly, having society pounding on them and they lose confidence. and making sure that they understand that they don't have to be perfect either. I think particularly young girls and young women tend to have this idea that if they're not perfect at something, then they shouldn't do it at all. And I think that that's an important lesson to pass on. But I think also being able to see role models and people who are doing these kinds of things is also important, which is why in Congress I started the STEM and STEAM, Women in STEM and STEAM caucus. It's the first one. If there has not been a caucus in Congress, a group of people who think about STEM and STEAM and women and other communities that are not necessarily at the table. And I think it's a tragedy that in a couple hundred years of our country that hasn't been a priority, but it is now in Congress. And we make sure that we try to think about ways to legislate to be helpful on that. An idea, as an example, is a piece of legislation that I'm working on to make sure that modeling and simulation is included in curriculum. And this is something that not just girls need, but all of us need when we're growing up. This is the kind of math skills that are needed and the kind of STEM skills that we need. So there's a lot of opportunities that we can do. I just put forward a piece of legislation to honor something called the Mercury 13, and they were 13 women who were trained and educated to be astronauts back in the day when the Mercury program was going on. None of them actually ended up making it into space because at that time you had to have pilots training specifically in jets, and as of course you know, the women weren't allowed to fly jets until relatively recently. And so the Mercury 13 piece of legislation is to give them recognition and a Medal of Honor to acknowledge them. And what's really exciting about putting that forward is it allows a new conversation, a new generation of young people to be able to learn about the Mercury 13, these 13 women who were involved in this way. Sally Ride's sister actually just emailed our office to thank us for putting forward that legislation. I didn't even know Sally Ride had a sister, which is really cool. And I think that we have real opportunities to advance these particular issues, but we have to all do it together.
It's incredible. When you look at STEM or STEAM, we've done some research, and outwardly there's also research on who goes into these fields, how is it driven, what's the foundation. One of the things that you find out is that many individuals who go into STEAM or to STEM are highly curious. They're very inquisitive. And if you look at early childhood, what's the number one thing little ones do? They love to explore, whether it's male, female, as you're going forward. One of the things that you find is how do we continue to nurture that sense of curiosity, of playfulness, of investigative exploration and play in young children? Because that is actually a foundation that you continue to promote. What you find is that as children get older and then get gender-based, we tend to lose that value, once again, of that curiosity, that playfulness that's essential in early childhood. And believe it or not, opens the doors to many of these careers. So again, looking at it from an early childhood point of view and what we should continue to nurture throughout educational patterns and as they get older.
Anyone else want to comment on that? Okay, just making sure. So this is a comment from someone in the audience, that the metrics are clear. Early childhood education leads to better careers, greater educational achievement, and far less criminal behavior. Are our leaders aware of the statistics? Okay.
Our state leaders are certainly aware. It is conversations that we have ongoing. We also have a very large advocacy population who engages and has ongoing conversations with legislators, with our office, the Office of Child Development and Early Learning. So they are very aware, and we continue to be thoughtful about making additional investments for our youngest learners and their families. Super committed to that, so absolutely.
Add maybe a slightly different perspective, not from an advocacy or political perspective, but really what drives that. We need to have that equitability of value in our parents and caregivers. especially very often those that are considered more marginalized, whether economically, emotionally, whichever it may be. We need to start there. We need to look at each parent and caregiver as an asset to young children's well-being, and then grow from there and have that advocacy movement start there in each family's home to be able to elevate as we go further up into advocacy, into policy. If we don't do that, then those advocates, which are families, often are not as represented, and we lose the value of that.
May I add a little bit to that?
Absolutely, please do.
So I think one of the themes that I'm hearing coming from here is the importance of the caregivers and the family adults in all of this, and making sure that we recognize that the first person that is literally here is that caregiver or that family member, and that person is part of the equation, such a serious part of the equation. Parental engagement and engagement of adults is so important, and I think we do sometimes just say that it's just the educator that is responsible for that, but rather it's everybody, it's the entire community, inclusive of the parent and inclusive of caregivers as well, who are outboard of the education proper. I think that we also, especially in marginalized communities, assume that adult isn't necessarily capable of being part of the solution, and that person is absolutely capable of being part of the solution. In fact, is central to being part of that solution. Sometimes when we're thinking about literacy and we're thinking about making sure that our kids can read, we don't remember that the key is making sure that the parents are sitting with the children and learning too, and reading too. And sometimes that parent isn't necessarily literate him or herself in English or at all, but that's okay, because even the act of just sitting with a book, sitting with that child with a book and looking through a book is an act of learning and an act of literacy. And so we need to make sure that we're empowering everybody to feel like that they're part of the solution, and I think sometimes we don't do that well enough. And I think when we're talking about financial literacy as well, or any of the other kinds of skills, is whenever you've got a child in a care situation or in a classroom, you've also possibly got their parent or their provider, or their care provider around you too, and they orbit a satellite. So you have opportunities to bring that grown-up in too, and to provide those kinds of skills to the grown-up that may be lacking too. As an example, financial literacy in the part of myself and my children.
That's terrific, and what a way to wrap up. I would like to thank Mr. Tony DeMarco, and he is Vice President for College Advancement here at RAC, as well as the Executive Director for this beautiful venue, the Miller Center. So thank you so much for your assistance. And thank you to this wonderful panel. This was terrific conversation. I saw a lot of heads nodding in the audience, and I really thank everyone really for being here, and I will toss it back to Representative Houlihan.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you also, Tony, for joining us, and thank you all to the panelists who were here and everybody who spent part of your Monday with us. Thank you. This is I think one of the most pressing issues of our time, is making sure that we're all able to be productive and happy and effective members of our communities. I want to end by saying once again, thank you. There are awesome, awesome tables outside for many of you guys to explore, and some of you guys have brought them here, the information here. Please make sure you avail yourself of that information. There's also lots and lots of awesome, awesome books out there too. My guess is that some of them are available for the taking, so please take them home, and if you have an opportunity, find a kid to sit with and read. Summer months are really, really important to make sure that you are keeping up with all of that kind of effort, to make sure that there's no learning loss and that there's maybe even some gain as well. And the last thing that I would say is, Sue wrote me a note to make sure that I don't miss it. Let's make sure. The comments that were not answered, if we didn't answer some, will be responded to over the next several days. So please make sure, if for some reason we didn't get to your question, you know that we will give you a call in the next couple of days to answer your questions. Thank you once again for coming, and I look forward to seeing you in our community.